last but certainly not least, we welcome you, Dr. Lobsang Sangay. You have been very patient. Senior Fellow, East Asian Legal Studies Program at Harvard University Law School. And I just want to thank both of you in this panel for coming forward. We look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson, Senator Boxer, and members of the subcommittee for the honor of speaking before you today. I also appreciate the Senate's strong support for Tibet, specifically Senate's letter to President Hu Jintao and the Senate's resolution on Tibet passed recently. You have demonstrated your leadership, and the convening of this hearing attests to your commitment to end the crisis in Tibet. I also agree with our Special Envoy, Lodi Gary, that the recent uprising in Tibet is a failure of 50 years of Chinese government occupation and misrule in Tibet. Like him, my family also suffered a great deal. One of my aunts who was pregnant and had to jump into a river with an infant in her hand because she found the weekly humiliation too much to bear. And my uncle also died of hunger in prison. So in that sense, nonviolence is tough, dialogue is tough. Having said that, I still believe that meaningful dialogue between His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Chinese government can bring a lasting solution to the Tibet issue. China wants to be a great nation. History has shown greatness cannot be bought in the marketplace and cannot be bought with force. Greatness has to be earned. In the last 50 years, China has transformed itself from a poor nation to booming economy. The world is mesmerized by its rapid modernization and economic growth. It is yet to be determined what kind of greatness is China heading for. The way China treats Tibet will reflect what kind of powerful nation China becomes. The present situation presents both a crisis and a tremendous opportunity. Now is the time for the Chinese leadership to demonstrate not only its strength, but also its reason, as well as its compassion to try to build a harmonious society for all. The scale and magnitude of the recent uprising in Tibet reflects the tipping point for the Tibetan people. As is often the case in ethnic conflict, when economic marginalization combines with cultural assimilation and political crackdown, you have all the elements of a potent and dangerous situation. If the tragedy in Tibet is not addressed soon, unfortunately, the possibility of escalating tension and conflict are not a question of if, but when. Now, what can the Senate do? As Madam Chair asks a question and you would like to have an action plan. And I have a suggestion. A first step would be to allow the Dalai Lama to be seen and heard by the Chinese people. Specifically, on March 30th, Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao said on Hong Kong television that Dalai Lama should use his influence to end violence in Tibet. I believe the Chinese government should allow the Dalai Lama to respond to Premier Wen Jiabao's call. In order for this to happen, the Chinese government should allow the Dalai Lama to speak directly to the people in Tibet. If the Chinese government is serious and sincere, then instead of demonizing him and blocking him out, they must allow his voice, his image, and his message of peace, justice, and reconciliation to reach the Chinese public directly. If the Dalai Lama were allowed to transmit a message through Chinese media in China, to use his authority amongst the Tibetan people to ensure peace and harmony of the Olympic torch passing through Tibet and the Games itself, this would be a significant step forward in dialogue. This would demonstrate to the Chinese public and the Chinese leadership the sincerity of the Dalai Lama. Finally, I strongly believe that our first priority is to build trust between Chinese and Tibetan people. Mutual understanding will require both sides to take some risk. Allowing the Dalai Lama's message to be heard inside China would be a powerful first step. Let me conclude by saying, in my current position at Harvard, I have worked earnestly and in good faith on facilitating people-to-people exchanges between Chinese and Tibetan scholars, which have led to 6 very productive sets of meetings over the past 6 years. I sincerely believe dialogue is the pathway to harmony, and I also believe it is possible. Now is the time for His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Chinese government to sit down face to face and reach a lasting and mutually agreeable solution. I pray that American leadership, through your Senate's office, will strongly support this approach. Thank you.
Well, I so appreciate both of your statements. Mr. Sangay, I'm very interested, and I think Senator Murkowski is as well, in what we can do to allow that kind of communication, because a message of peace from the Dalai Lama would go a long way, I think, to making sure that the people in Tibet get the message, and within the Tibet region and the rest of China as well. Because what is worrying me, as I said before to Mr. Gary, is my concern as I read the press, and this is just from the press, I don't know if it's true, that there's more and more strain between those outside Tibet and those inside Tibet. In other words, I'm fearful that the majority of the Chinese people are maybe getting more hostile toward the Tibetan people. I don't know if that's true, so maybe that would be my question. Do you think that what do you think, if you could characterize the views of the majority of the Chinese toward the Tibetan people? Would you say that they have an attitude, as we say in America, live and let live, or gee, we don't understand them, or what do you think? Because we know so little about, can't find out really the true public opinion, but your sense of it, what is it most of the Chinese people feel toward the Tibetan people?
Till the recent uprising, I feel most of the Chinese were ignorant of what was going on, or they really did not care, because Tibet is in the western region, which is marginal in their day-to-day life. Since the uprising, because of the Chinese government one-sided or overemphasis on the afternoon of 14th March riots in Lhasa, I think it has unleashed, unfortunately, Han Chinese chauvinism and nationalism towards Tibetan people. That has distorted the image of Tibetan people. And that begs the question, actually, because on the one hand, the Chinese government used to project Tibet and Tibetan people before the uprising as peaceful, loving, grateful, loyal, and smiling citizens of China. Now, after the protests, now the Tibetans are projected as disloyal, ungrateful thugs, vandalizers, and killers. Now, which image is true? That I think the Chinese people has to ask, because they were being given one image for the last 50 years. Now they are given the other image. I think this distortion of image calls for a need for the Chinese people to hear His Holiness' message of peace directly. And then that's why we propose this, because Chinese Premier Vanjaba himself proposed this. He said, Dalai Lama should use his influence to end violence in Tibet.
Right.
That's the proposition. And I think through the Office of Senate and the US leadership to respond and say, well, let Dalai Lama hear, let the Chinese people in China and Tibetan people in Tibet hear what he has to say.
That's a good point, because the Chinese leadership has said